My name is Keth Voren, and I am a keeper of dead things. That is not a dramatic way of saying it. It is simply the truth. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen in this galaxy, every species that built cities among the stars and then went quiet, exists now only inside the walls of the Grand Archive on Velmora. Their languages, their art, their wars, their prayers, their last broadcasts sent into the dark before silence took them. All of it lives here, in my care, inside long silver shelves that stretch from the floor to ceiling so high you cannot see them without climbing. I have worked in this archive for 63 years. I started as a junior clerk, filing dust-covered tablets in the lower halls where no one goes unless something is lost. I worked my way up through patience and a certain stubbornness that my supervisor called, on my evaluation forms, an admirable commitment to thoroughness. I knew what she actually meant. I never stopped asking questions. I never put a file away without reading it first. That habit made me slow. It also made me good. The Grand Archive is the oldest institution in the Velshari continuance. Our civilization has existed for over 40,000 years, and in that time we have watched 14 spacefaring species appear, rise, spread across star systems, and vanish. Some left ruins, some left only mathematics, scratched into ore deposits on moons no one visits. One species, the Turith, left nothing at all except a single phrase carved into the exterior hull of an abandoned station. I translated it myself, years ago. It said, "We were here and we were glad." I think about that phrase often. The Velshari have survived this long, I believe, because we do not make war. We observe, we record. We trade knowledge instead of taking territory. We have disputes, of course, all species do, but we settle them with discussion, with negotiation, with the slow and sometimes exhausting business of finding agreement. Our council has 41 members and they have never once voted unanimously on anything. That used to frustrate me when I was young. Now I think it is probably healthy. We are not powerful, in the way that other civilizations use that word. We have no great fleet, no vast army. What we have is information. 4 decades of diplomatic standing. A reputation for neutrality that every empire in the known galaxy values. Because when your enemies hate you, and your friends have agendas, a neutral party with good records is the most useful thing in existence. That is what I am. That is what I was, before the morning a junior clerk named Res Kaveth dropped a cracked data tablet on my desk and changed everything. It was early. The archive's main hall was empty. Most of the staff did not arrive until the second hour, and I had always preferred the first. The quiet of it, the way the light came in low through the observation panels and turned the silver shelves gold for a few minutes before the day began properly. I was cataloging a set of Durath astronomical charts, which is exactly as tedious as it sounds, when I heard rapid footsteps in the corridor. Res Kaveth was young. He had been working in the lower recovery vaults for about 6 months, which meant his job was to sort through recovered material from deep space salvage, fragments brought in by traders, researchers, and occasionally by accident, when a drilling operation hit something ancient and unexpected. Most of what came through the lower vaults was not valuable. Broken equipment, corrupted files, material that was too damaged to be reconstructed. He processed it, logged it, and moved on. That morning, his eyes were wide. He set the tablet on my desk with both hands, the way you set something down when you are afraid it might break. It was a flat, rectangular object, dark gray. The surface cracked across one corner in a long diagonal line. The cracks had been sealed, probably by the salvage team, but poorly. The edges were chipped. One whole section of the surface was dark and unresponsive. "I found it in the overnight delivery from the Velanara salvage run," he said. The site was in the outer meridian, a debris field. They thought it was just equipment wreckage. He paused. "Sir, look at the serial notation on the bottom edge." I turned the tablet over. The notation was small, pressed into the material rather than printed on it. I had to angle the tablet toward the light to read it clearly. When I did, I set it down again very carefully. The notation was in old precursor script. You may not know what that means. Most people in the galaxy do not, because the precursors are the kind of subject that people find either deeply fascinating or entirely unimportant, depending on their temperament. I find them fascinating, which is why I have spent more hours than I can count studying the small collection of precursor material that the archive holds. The precursors were the first spacefaring civilization, not the first civilization in general. There may have been others before them, in the deep prehistory of the galaxy, but if so, they left nothing we have found. The precursors are the oldest known. Their records suggest they had faster-than-light travel 90,000 years ago, when most of the species alive today were not yet standing upright on their home planets. They explored extensively, they cataloged, they built, and then, approximately 85,000 years ago, they disappeared. We do not know why. Their records, What we have of them, which is not much, do not explain it. They simply stop. The last precursor record in the archive is a survey report from a star system in the outer rim, describing a young planet with a reducing atmosphere and complex organic chemistry. Standard language, clinical observations, no sense of urgency, and then nothing after that. What we do have, in addition to surveys and technical records, is a collection of documents the precursors apparently created specifically to be left behind. They called this collection, in direct translation, the Caution Records. Other scholars call it the Anathema Codex, which sounds more dramatic and therefore gets used more often. Whatever you call it, it contains warnings, observations the precursors wanted to preserve for whoever came after them, whoever rose next in the galaxy they were apparently preparing to leave. Most of the Caution Records are stored in a secured section of the archive. They are not classified exactly, but they require authorization to access, because some of the content is destabilizing. Species-specific information, names of civilizations that rose after the precursors vanished, written in a document that predates those civilizations by tens of thousands of years. Methods of prediction that no one in current scholarship has been able to explain. The records make people uncomfortable, so they are kept in a room with a coded door, and most people pretend they do not think about them. I think about them quite often. The piece that Reskaveth had found was not in that secured room. It had come from the debris field of a destroyed station, precursor construction apparently, though the Velinara salvage team had not recognized it as such until it was already in pieces. This tablet had survived. Barely. I connected it to a reader slowly, testing first whether the connection would hold. The surface flickered. I held my breath. Text appeared, damaged, whole sections replaced by static, others reduced to partial words, but readable. I began at the beginning, which is always where you begin. The first section of the tablet was technical. Navigation data, reference coordinates, measurements in precursor units that I had to convert mentally as I read. This was standard for precursor documents. They rarely began with the human point, as my colleague Drev Yasin liked to say. They began with context. They positioned you first before they told you anything important. I read through the navigation section. I noted the coordinates, which I would need to log. I read through a dense passage about atmospheric classification systems that had not been used for 80,000 years. My eyes were beginning to feel the particular tired flatness that comes from reading old script on a damaged surface, and I was thinking about making a second cup of warm broth when the text changed. The clinical language ended. What replaced it was different. Shorter sentences, careful word choice, the particular quality of writing that occurs when someone wants to be completely and unmistakably understood. I leaned forward. This record is addressed to those who come after. If you are reading this, you have reached the stage of development at which this information becomes relevant. We have prepared several such records. This one concerns a specific world, a specific species, and a specific warning that we believe is more important than any other we will leave you. I stopped. I read that again. More important than any other. The Caution Records had warned against 17 different species across various entries, civilizations that had proven dangerous in different ways. Some had been territorial, some had carried plagues without knowing it, some had manipulated younger species for resources, but not one of those warnings had described itself as the most important. I kept reading. The world is located at the coordinates noted in the first section of this record. You will know it by its moon, one large natural satellite, pale in color, visible without optical enhancement from the planet's surface. The world itself is small, dense, covered mostly in water. The atmosphere is thin by galactic standards but rich in oxygen. It is unremarkable in almost every measurable way. I had already noted those coordinates. My hand had simply written them and moved on. Now I looked back at them. I cross-referenced them with the archive's stellar cartography system without standing up, using the desk terminal. The system returned a result in less than a second. The coordinates pointed to a system in the Orion Spur, a small star, slightly yellow, slightly warm, several planets in orbit. The third planet was the one that matched the description. Small, dense, mostly water, one pale moon. The system had a catalog name, a long identifying number that meant nothing. But beside the number, in the taxonomy field, there was a species classification flag, a current one. The system was inhabited. The species living there had achieved basic atmospheric flight approximately 300 years ago. They had achieved orbit 200 years ago. They had been formally classified by the Velshari Survey Corps 67 years ago, during a standard outer rim sweep. They were listed as Category 4, nascent pre-space flight, observation only. They had not yet left their home system in any meaningful way. They were, by every standard the continuance used, a young species, a small species, effectively harmless. Their name in the archive was a transliteration of what they called themselves, humans. I returned to the tablet. Of all the creatures we encountered in our long years among the stars, and we encountered many, there is one you must not mistake for prey. They come from this world. They are small. They are brief. Their individual lives last less than 100 of their planet's years, which is a span so short that we initially did not take them seriously. That was our error, and we document it here so that you do not repeat it. The tablet surface crackled. A line of static crossed the text. I waited. It settled. Do not be deceived by their size, their softness, or the brevity of their lives. We have watched them. We have studied what they do when they are hurt. We have studied what they do when they are frightened. We have studied what they do when their backs are against the wall and every option appears to be closed. Another crack of static. Longer this time. When the text returned, it was mid-sentence, several lines skipped. They carry their losses forward. They do not discard what breaks them. They use it. There is no species we have found in all the galaxy that recovers from destruction the way this one does. They have come to the edge of ending. Their entire world, their entire species, multiple times. Each time they rebuilt. Each time they came back stronger than before, and angry in a way that does not fade quickly. Then, the part I have never been able to stop hearing in my mind, even now, all these years later, came the final legible passage before the damaged section swallowed the text completely. Do not wake them. They are not dangerous because they are violent. Many species are violent. They are dangerous because they remember everything, they adapt to anything, and they do not stop. We say this having watched species that shook the foundations of solar systems. We say this having survived things that ended civilizations older than ourselves. Of every creature we have seen rise in this galaxy, this is the one we would not choose to anger. Do not wake them. And then the static took the rest. The corner of the screen where the text should have continued showed only broken gray light, like a window looking into nothing. I sat back in my chair. The archive was still quiet around me. Reskaveth had gone back to his station in the lower vaults. The morning light still came in low through the observation panels, still gold, still peaceful. The astronomical charts I had been cataloging were still open on the corner of my desk, waiting patiently for me to finish them. I looked at them for a long moment, then I looked at the tablet, then I looked at the catalog entry for the human home system, still open on my terminal. The small classification flag, the tidy summary, Category 4, nascent, pre-space flight, observation only. I thought about the precursors, 90,000 years of civilization, faster than light travel before most of the current galaxy's species had evolved past simple biology, writing a warning and calling it more important than any other. I thought about the word they had chosen, dangerous. Not difficult, not complicated, not to be handled carefully. Dangerous. I sat with that for a long time. Eventually I picked up the Durath astronomical charts and put them in their proper place on the shelf. I logged the tablet with a full notation, origin site, condition, preliminary content summary. I labeled it as a precursor caution record fragment, flagged it for the secured collection, and noted that portions were unreadable due to surface damage. Then I wrote, in the notes field, a single line of my own. Recommend priority repair assessment and full reconstruction attempt. Content is potentially significant. I submitted the log. I stood up. I went and made my warm broth. And then I went back to my desk and sat down, because I could not stop thinking about the coordinates. Small world, mostly water, one pale moon. Do not wake them. I opened the human catalog entry again and read it from the beginning, all the way through, every dry line of Survey Corps observational data. It took most of the morning. The report was thorough but clinical. Population estimates, atmospheric composition, basic technological assessment, the usual recommendation to maintain observation distance and avoid contact until the species achieved independent spaceflight. There was no mention of what they had survived. There was no mention of their history. Survey Corps reports do not include that. They observe what is visible from a safe distance, they classify, and they move on. I requested access to the deeper files through the research system. Historical records, where they existed. Cultural data pulled from long-range signal intercepts. Their broadcasts, traveling outward from their world at the speed of light, reaching us decades after being sent. We had been quietly collecting them for years, the way we collected signals from all developing species. We did not decode them in real time, usually. There was too much. The files sat in storage until someone with a research reason asked for them. I had a research reason. I settled into my chair with the particular quiet focus that I have always felt when something important is in front of me, and I began to read. What I found over the next several hours was not what I expected. I had expected a standard developmental history, young species, difficult early period, gradual improvement, the slow upward line of progress that most civilizations showed when you plotted their growth over time. What I found was not a line. It was something more like a heartbeat, Up and crashing down and dragging back up again, over and over, each recovery coming from a lower point than the one before, each rise climbing somehow higher than the last. They had nearly ended themselves more times than I could immediately count. Diseases that moved through their entire population. Conflicts so large that whole generations were lost. Environmental changes they had caused themselves through carelessness, which they then spent generations trying to repair. And every time, they came back. Not the same. Changed. Marked by what had happened, but present. Still building. Still moving forward. I sat back from the terminal when I finally stopped reading. Outside the observation panels, the light had shifted. It was not morning anymore. I had missed the midday meal entirely without noticing. The archive was busier now, the afternoon staff moving through the halls, the soft sounds of work, tablets sliding on shelves, terminals humming, the occasional low conversation, normal sounds, familiar sounds. I looked at the human catalog entry one more time, the neat little flag, the tidy classification, Category 4, nascent, observation only. Somewhere in that file, buried under Survey Corps language, was the history of a species that had survived everything the universe had thrown at it, and had never once stopped reaching for the next thing. And somewhere in a cracked precursor tablet, now sitting in a box in my logging system waiting to be moved to the secured collection, was a warning written 90,000 years ago by the wisest beings this galaxy had ever produced. Do not wake them. I made a note in my personal research log, not an official file, just my own record, the kind I had kept since my first year as a clerk. The note said, I believe the precursors were not being poetic. I intend to find out what they knew. I closed the terminal, I gathered my things, and I went home. In the gold and gray light of Velmora's evening, already knowing that I was not going to sleep well. The humans had no idea, at that point, that anyone was paying attention. They were still on their own world, still looking up at their pale moon, still arguing about the best way to reach the stars. They had no reason to think about the galaxy watching them. They had no reason to think about the galaxy at all. That would change. 10 years pass quickly when you are busy, and I was always busy. The tablet sat in the secured collection. The repair team had worked on it twice, recovering a few more partial lines from the damaged section, but nothing complete enough to change what I already knew. The warning was clear. The species was identified. The coordinates matched. Everything the precursors had written pointed at one small world with one pale moon, circling one quiet star at the edge of a spiral arm. And for 10 years I watched that world from a comfortable distance, the way you watch a fire you are not sure about, close enough to see it clearly, far enough to feel safe. I had been promoted twice in that decade. I was now senior archivist, which meant I had my own office with a real window, instead of an observation panel, a larger research budget, and responsibility for a staff of 31. I also had, which mattered more to me, unrestricted access to every file in the archive, including the secured collection. I used that access often. In 10 years I had built the most complete picture of human history that any non-human scholar had ever assembled. I knew their ancient empires, the ones built on rivers in warm valleys, the ones that stretched across continents on the backs of armies. I knew their collapses, their recoveries, their long, slow rebuilding periods. I knew the names they gave their worst moments, and the names they gave their best ones. I knew that they had a habit, which no other species I had studied showed to quite the same degree, of looking back at their worst periods and writing about them obsessively. Stories, histories, records, memorials, as though they were determined to make sure no one forgot. They called this, in one of their most common languages, remembrance. I had a colleague, Drev Yasin, who specialized in exopsychology, the study of how different species think. I showed him my notes once, carefully, without mentioning the codex, just the historical patterns. He looked through them for a long time and then said something I have never forgotten. Most species, he said, process their disasters by moving past them. They grieve, they record, and then they allow the memory to soften. It becomes history, then legend, then background. The events are acknowledged but not carried. He tapped the notes. These ones carry everything. They build monuments. They hold annual commemorations. They teach their children the details of events that happened hundreds of years before those children were born. They don't want to soften the memory. They want it to stay sharp. I asked him why he thought that was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think it's how they make sure it doesn't happen again. He handed the notes back and went to his lunch. I sat with what he had said for a very long time. The first human ship appeared in Velshari monitored space on the 43rd day of the 3rd season, in the 67th year after the initial human catalog entry was filed. I was in my office reviewing a grant application when the alert came through, a standard contact notification, the kind the monitoring division sent whenever a new vessel entered the outer range. Most of the time, these were known traders, survey ships, the usual traffic of a busy galactic neighborhood. This one was flagged differently. New configuration, unknown registry, origin, the Terran home system. I put down the grant application. Humans had achieved faster-than-light travel. That was the first thing the alert told me, and it told me secondhand. The Survey Corps had apparently updated the human catalog entry 3 months earlier, noting the detection of early prototype FTL signatures from the home system, but had not yet reclassified the species. The flag still said Category 4. Someone in the monitoring division had simply not gotten around to updating it. I updated it myself. Category 5, active spaceflight, early expansion phase. Then I went to the docking records and requested the arrival data. The vessel was called Terra Firma. It was, by Velshari standards, not large. It had the particular look of something built by people who had not been doing this for very long, functional in a slightly over-engineered way, as though the designers were not yet sure which parts were actually necessary, and had included everything just to be safe. The hull was thick. The engines were larger than they probably needed to be. There were what appeared to be redundant systems layered over redundant systems, backup upon backup, as though the builders could not quite bring themselves to trust that any single thing would hold. I noted that. I found it interesting. The vessel had docked at the outer receiving platforms because no one had cleared it for inner access. A formal first contact protocol was being assembled hastily by the diplomatic division, who had apparently also missed the updated survey data and were now scrambling. I had watched diplomatic divisions scramble before. It was not their most graceful state. I put in a request to observe the initial contact in person. It was approved without comment, probably because no one in the diplomatic division had thought to restrict attendance yet. I took the transit line to the outer platforms and arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled greeting. I was, I believe, the most prepared person in the room. She came through the umbilical connection first, which surprised me. In my experience, leaders send representatives ahead. They stay behind protective layers of protocol. She did not. She was the commanding officer of the Terra Firma, as I would learn shortly. Her name was Marin Solis. She was, by human standards, middle-aged, perhaps 50 of their years, which I was still adjusting my thinking to, because 50 years is not very long at all by any scale I was accustomed to. She was not tall, as individual humans went. She had dark hair cut practically short, and the particular posture of someone who had spent years in enclosed spaces, upright, economical, no wasted movement. She stepped through the umbilical into the receiving corridor of Velmora's outer platform, looked around at the assembled diplomatic team, at the banners that someone had hastily installed, at the formal greeting arch that someone else had hastily cleaned, and she smiled. That smile. I have thought about it many times since. It was not a nervous smile. It was not the careful, controlled expression of a diplomat trying to make a good impression. It was the genuine, uncomplicated expression of someone who found the situation delightful. Like a child who has arrived somewhere they have always wanted to go and cannot quite believe they are actually there. The lead diplomat, a very senior official named Vessel Khan who had managed 12 first contact procedures in his career, stepped forward and delivered the formal Velshari greeting in 3 languages, which is standard protocol. She waited for him to finish, then said something in her own language, which our translation systems, we had been preparing them for 3 months, rendered as, "Hello, I'm Marin Solis, commander of the Terra Firma out of Earth. We're very glad to be here. We come in peace, as they say." Then she smiled again and added, "We've been looking forward to this for a long time." Vessel Khan blinked. He had prepared a 14-step greeting protocol. She had bypassed all of it in 4 sentences, and was now looking around the corridor with the focused interest of someone cataloging details. I found, to my surprise, that I liked her immediately. The formal diplomatic process lasted 3 days. I attended every session I was permitted to attend, and a few I attended on the edge of, standing near the back, where no one asked what I was doing there. Humans, I discovered, were extremely talkative, not in the excessive or exhausting way. They were not loud as a rule, or aggressive in conversation, but they asked questions constantly. They wanted to know things. They wanted to know how the archive worked, what the Velshari ate, how long the station had existed, how many species currently held diplomatic standing with the continuance, what the process was for filing a trade agreement, whether the artistic pieces in the diplomatic hall were originals or reproductions. Vessel Khan answered patiently. He was good at his job. I noticed that the humans wrote everything down. Every answer, every piece of information offered. Noted, recorded, filed. They had small devices they carried for this purpose. In quieter moments, I saw them reviewing their notes, checking details against each other, clarifying small points they had written differently. On the second day, one of the junior members of the human delegation, a young man named Callum Park, who appeared to be their cultural liaison, wandered away from the main group during a break, and found his way to the edge of the archive's public access hall. He stood at the entrance and stared inside with an expression I can only describe as hunger. I was passing through and stopped beside him. "Is this the archive?" he asked. His translation earpiece had been calibrated well. The Velshari words came out clearly, with only a slight delay. "It is," I said. He stared inside for another long moment, then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "How old is it?" "The collection spans 40,000 years, I said. "The building itself has been on this site for 22,000. He turned to look at me. His expression was something I did not immediately have a word for. A kind of overwhelmed reverence, mixed with something that might have been grief, or longing, or both. "We lost so much," he said, "in our early period. Libraries, records, whole languages. We lost them, and we can't get them back." He looked at the archive again. "Something like this. A place where nothing gets lost. That's what we've always wanted." I stood with him for a moment. Then I said, "Then you are very welcome to use it." His expression changed to that simple, unguarded delight again. He thanked me 3 times and then hurried back to find the rest of his delegation. I stood in the entrance of the archive for a while after he had gone, looking at the long silver shelves. I thought about the precursor tablet in the secured collection, 2 floors up, sitting in its sealed case. I thought about the word remembrance. The trade agreement was signed on the 4th day. It was modest, a framework agreement mostly establishing communication protocols and mutual access to certain categories of publicly available research. The substance was not important yet. The substance would come later, as contact deepened and both sides learned what the other had that was worth trading. What mattered was that the framework existed, a handshake across 40,000 years of separate history. I watched Marin Solis sign it. She used a physical pen, an instrument that leaves a mark directly on a surface, rather than a digital signature. I asked her about it afterward, during the informal gathering that followed the signing ceremony. "Old habit," she said. "My grandmother taught me that some things are important enough to sign by hand. It's slower, and it smears if you're not careful, but the mark is actually yours. No one can fake it exactly." She looked at the signed document, now being carefully preserved by the diplomatic team. It felt like the right kind of document for a physical signature. I thought about that for a long time afterward. In 40,000 years, the Velshari had never once signed a treaty with a physical pen. We had digital archives, cryptographic signatures, multi-layered verification systems. Every treaty was perfectly preserved, perfectly reproducible, perfectly secure, and not one of them had ever felt quite the way this one looked, sitting on the ceremony table with ink that was actually still drying. The terra firma departed on the 5th day. The crew assembled at the umbilical in a way that was informal and a little chaotic. People checking things, carrying equipment, talking to each other in overlapping bursts of sound that the translation systems only partially captured. They were not ceremonial about leaving. They were businesslike. The work was done. They were going back to do more work. Marin Solis shook Vessel Khan's hand, a human gesture he had been briefed on and accepted with good grace, and then walked the line of Velshari officials assembled to see them off, shaking each hand in turn, making brief, direct eye contact with each person, saying something quiet that the translation systems caught as variations of "thank you" and "we'll be back." When she reached me, she paused. I was not a diplomatic official. I was simply standing there, the way I had been standing in the back of rooms for 5 days, watching. "You're the archivist," she said. It was not a question. "I am," I said. She looked at me with that focused, detailed cataloging attention for a moment. Then she said, "You know more about us than you're letting on." It was not an accusation. She said it calmly, with a slight tilt of her head, as though she found it interesting rather than alarming, as though she would have done exactly the same thing in my position. "I have studied your species," I said carefully, "for some years." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Good. We'd rather be understood than assumed about." She held out her hand. I had been watching the gesture for 5 days and I took it correctly. Her grip was firm, not aggressive, but definite. "Come visit Earth sometime, Archivist. We have libraries too, not as old as yours, but we're proud of them." She smiled once more, and then she was gone, walking back through the umbilical with the same economical efficiency with which she had done everything. The umbilical detached. The terra firma moved away from the platform on maneuvering thrusters. I watched it through the observation window until it was small enough to be a point of light, and then not even that. That night I went back to my office and wrote for 3 hours. Not an official report. I would write those properly in the days to come. This was my personal log, the record I kept for myself, in language that was mine rather than the archive's careful formal style. I wrote down everything I had observed, the way they moved through unfamiliar spaces with curiosity rather than caution, The way they asked questions without embarrassment, openly acknowledging what they did not know. The way Callum Park had stood at the entrance of the archive looking as though someone had just shown him something he had been searching for his entire life. I wrote down the physical pen and the drying ink. I wrote down Marin Solis saying we'd rather be understood than assumed about, which had settled into my mind and would not move. And then I wrote down the things I had not said during those 5 days. The things I had observed and noted and carried quietly. I had watched them closely for 5 days, and in 5 days I had seen no cruelty, no posturing, no subtle tests of dominance which almost every other species engaged in during first contact, small maneuvers, careful positioning, the delicate business of establishing where each party stood. The humans had not done any of that. They had simply arrived, been themselves, done their work, and left. That in itself was unusual enough to note, but it was not what had stayed with me most. What had stayed with me most was something I had seen on the first evening, when the formal session had ended, and the delegation was being escorted to their temporary quarters. 2 of the junior crew members were walking together, talking quietly, and one of them, I do not know what they were talking about, put a hand briefly on the other's shoulder. A small gesture, a moment of connection that had nothing to do with diplomacy or protocol or any observable practical purpose. Most species I had observed in diplomatic contexts were performing, at every moment. They were showing their best version of themselves, and their best version was professional, controlled, careful. These 2 had simply forgotten, for a moment, that they were anywhere significant. They had just been 2 people walking down a corridor. I wrote, they are comfortable with each other in a way that suggests genuine trust, not performed unity but actual cohesion. I do not yet know what to make of this. Then I sat back and looked at what I had written. Then I went to the secured collection. The precursor tablet was where it always was, in its sealed case on the 3rd shelf. I did not take it out. I simply stood in front of it in the dim light of the secure room, looking at the cracks across its surface, the dark section where the text had been lost. Do not wake them. They were awake now. They were already awake when the precursors wrote that, I suspected, already out among the stars in some form, in whatever earliest iteration of spaceflight they had managed before the precursors vanished. And now, 85,000 years later, they were at my front door with a physical pen and a commander who looked at an alien space station with uncomplicated delight. I stood in front of the tablet for a long time. Here is what troubled me. Standing there in the quiet of the secured room, the precursors had called them dangerous. And nothing I had seen in 5 days contradicted that assessment. But nothing I had seen in 5 days looked like what I would normally call dangerous either. I was beginning to think that was the point. The most dangerous fire is not the one that roars and throws off heat you can feel from a distance. It is the quiet one. The one that has been burning steadily for a very long time, that has learned exactly how to sustain itself, that has fuel you did not know was there. I thought about their history, all those collapses and recoveries, all those terrible lows and the long climbs back out, all that careful, obsessive remembrance. I thought about Marin Solis, who shook every hand and looked every person in the eye, and said we'd rather be understood than assumed about. I thought about the fire that had been burning for 85,000 years, and was now, politely, at my door. I went home. I tried to sleep. I wrote one more line in my personal log before I did. They came in peace today. Every record I have tells me they mean it. I believe them. And still, I believe the precursors too. The Council reviewed the first contact report and issued a warm, formal statement welcoming humanity to the community of spacefaring civilizations. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and had been used, with minor adjustments, 14 times before. No one on the Council had read my personal log. I had not expected them to. But somewhere on a small world with one pale moon, Marin Solis was filing her own report. And in shipyards and research halls and planning offices across the human home system, people who had spent their whole lives looking up at the sky were now looking outward, toward the stars, toward the neighbors they had just met for the first time. They were building, just as the precursors had said they would. 5 years after the terra firma docked at Velmora, humans were everywhere. Not in large numbers, not yet. But they were present in a way that felt larger than their actual count suggested. There were human researchers at the archive, 3 of them, on a rotating academic exchange that Callum Park had apparently spent 2 years organizing after his first visit. There was a small human trade office near the diplomatic quarter, staffed by 4 people who negotiated material exchanges with the cheerful persistence of people who genuinely enjoyed negotiating. There were human vessels in Velshari monitored space on a regular basis now, supply runs, survey ships, one very enthusiastic team of young scientists studying our star system's outer belt who had asked permission so politely and in such careful formal Velshari that the monitoring division had approved the request before anyone thought to check who was asking. I knew all of their names. I knew where they were from, what they studied, who they reported to. I knew that the chief researcher in the archive exchange program, a woman named Dr. Adeze Okonkwo, had spent 11 years reconstructing a lost dialect of a language from her own planet's ancient history. I knew that the head of the trade office, a quiet man named Henrik Strom, had grown up in a region of his world that had once been destroyed by conflict and been entirely rebuilt within his grandfather's lifetime. I knew that the youngest member of the Outer Belt survey team, a 23-year-old named Priya Mehta, had applied for the mission 4 times before being accepted, and had cried when she got the approval message, according to her own written account, which she had published openly on a human information network that I had begun monitoring carefully. This monitoring was, I should say, not unusual or inappropriate. We monitored all spacefaring species. It was standard procedure. What was unusual was the volume of information available. Humans shared an extraordinary amount about themselves, openly and without apparent concern. They had vast public networks where individuals wrote their thoughts, described their days, argued about ideas, celebrated things they loved, and mourned things they had lost. The monitoring division did not know what to do with this. They had never encountered a species that generated so much personal record voluntarily. I found it invaluable. I also found it, at times, deeply moving in ways I had not expected. The trouble began, as trouble in the galaxy so often does, somewhere other than where you are looking. The Maketh hegemony had existed for 11,000 years. That is not the oldest civilization in this part of the galaxy. The Velshari have 4 times that history, but 11,000 years is long enough to build habits that feel like laws. The Maketh had spent most of those 11,000 years expanding, not brutally, not in the fashion of ancient conquest empires, but steadily, and with the calm certainty of people who believed, genuinely and without much examination, that the space they occupied was rightfully theirs, and that the space adjacent to them was simply space they had not gotten to yet. They were not malicious. I want to be fair about that. The Maketh I had met personally, and I had met several, at diplomatic functions and academic conferences, were intelligent, cultured people, with a rich artistic tradition, and a genuine love of complex food. Their architecture was extraordinary. Their mathematics had contributed things to galactic scholarship that we still used. They had never committed what any serious definition would call atrocities. They had also never, in 11,000 years, encountered anything they could not either absorb or dismiss. That confidence had become invisible to them, the way a heavy coat becomes invisible when you have worn it long enough. You stop feeling the weight. You stop thinking about what it would be like to remove it. Ardennes Station was a human settlement on the outer edge of a system that sat, in the traditional Maketh view of things, within their zone of natural expansion. The Velshari had no formal claim to that system. No one had, technically, until the humans filed settlement papers 4 years after their first contact with us. A careful, thorough legal filing that cited 3 separate frameworks of galactic territorial law, and included, I was told, a 40-page appendix of supporting documentation. The humans did their paperwork. That was something I had noted early, and noted often. The Maketh noticed the settlement 18 months after it was established. Their initial response was a diplomatic inquiry. Formal, politely worded, asking on what basis the claim had been filed. The Human Trade Office responded with a copy of the 40-page appendix and an invitation to discuss the matter further at a scheduled conference. The Maketh did not attend the conference. 3 months after the missed conference, a Maketh patrol vessel made a close pass of Ardennes Station, which held at that point a permanent population of roughly 4,000 people. Scientists, engineers, families, a school with 230 children enrolled, a medical center, 2 agricultural processing facilities, and, according to the most recent census data I had accessed, a community garden that had apparently become a point of considerable local pride. The patrol pass was a message. In Maketh diplomatic language it meant, "We are aware of you, and you should be aware of us." It was the first step in a sequence of pressure tactics the Maketh had used successfully dozens of times over the centuries. The sequence went, patrol pass, formal demand, negotiated withdrawal, settlement abandoned. Clean, bloodless, effective. It had always worked because the species on the other end of the sequence were either too weak to resist or too wise to bother. I was in my office when the report of the patrol pass came through the monitoring network. I read it twice. Then I sat very still for a moment, thinking about what I knew. Then I pulled up the Human Public Information Network. Within 6 hours of the patrol pass, the story was everywhere on it. Not because someone had officially released it. It had simply been reported by people on Ardennes Station, who had seen the Maketh vessel and written about it, the way humans wrote about everything. There were accounts from station personnel, photographs taken through observation windows, A long, careful analysis by someone whose profile identified them as a retired military logistics officer, and a thread of several hundred responses from ordinary people across the human home system and its growing network of settlements. I read the responses carefully. They were not panicked. That was the first thing I noticed. There was anger, quite a lot of it, expressed with the particular colorful intensity that humans brought to strong emotion. And there was concern, especially in the posts from people who had family on Ardennes Station. But there was no collapse into fear. No calls to give the settlement up and come home. The dominant tone, running under the anger and the worry like a current, was something I could only describe as settled determination. One post, from a woman who identified herself as a grandmother with a daughter and 3 grandchildren on Ardennes Station, stayed with me. It was not long. She wrote, "My family did not go out there to be pushed around. Neither did any of the others. We have been through worse than a patrol ship and we are still here. They will need to do better than that." I printed that post and kept it in my desk. I wrote my second report to the council the following week. The first report, the one I had submitted after Marin Solis and the Terra Firma, in which I had noted the unusual qualities I observed in the human delegation, and recommended that the continuance develop a more thorough strategic understanding of humanity's historical profile, had been received, acknowledged, and filed. It had not been discussed at any council session I was aware of. Vessel Khan had told me, kindly, that it was a well-written report, and that the council appreciated my thoroughness. This second report was less careful. I laid out the situation at Ardennes Station plainly. I described the Maketh tactical sequence and its historical application. I included my analysis of the human response, not the official diplomatic response which was still being formulated, but the public response, the one happening in real time on their open networks, which I believed was more indicative of what would actually happen than any formal statement. Then I wrote a section that I knew would make people uncomfortable. I wrote about human history. Specifically, I wrote about what happened when humans were pushed. I had spent years in that archive data, and I knew it better by now than I knew almost anything else. I described their largest historical conflicts, the ones that had nearly broken their world, and I described them not in terms of cause or ideology, which is how most historical analysis focuses, but in terms of scale and recovery speed. How quickly they mobilized, how thoroughly they committed, how completely they rebuilt afterward, and how much faster they moved in the rebuilding than they had in the initial construction. The numbers were, when laid out plainly, striking. I included a section on what I called the arsenal principle, a term I had taken from their own historical writing. In their largest historical conflicts, human industrial output had increased by factors of 10 or 20 within a single year, not gradually, rapidly, as though the civilization had been moving at a comfortable pace and had suddenly, when pressed, revealed that the comfortable pace was not its actual speed at all. It had simply been the speed it chose to move at when there was no particular reason to move faster. I ended the report with a recommendation. The Velshari continuance should formally and publicly support the human territorial claim at Ardennes Station, both on legal grounds. The claim was filed correctly and was entirely valid, and on the grounds that allowing the Maketh pressure sequence to succeed would establish a precedent that would harm galactic stability. I also added, in the final paragraph, a line that I knew was too direct for a formal council report but that I could not bring myself to remove. It said, "The Maketh hegemony has never encountered a species with this particular historical profile. I do not believe they understand what they are doing. I recommend that someone tell them." I submitted the report. I waited. Councillor Yev Tan called me to her office 4 days later. She was the longest-serving member of the council, a small, precise woman, with the kind of stillness that comes from having sat in difficult rooms for a very long time, without being broken by any of them. I respected her. I also found her at times exhausting, because she was exceptionally good at taking the sharpest point of an argument and sanding it smooth while appearing to agree with you. "Your report was thorough," she said, as I settled into the chair across from her desk. "Thank you, Counselor." Perhaps thorough is not the right word. She considered. Thorough implies completeness. "Your report was thorough in its historical data and quite selective in its interpretations." "I included my methodology," I said. "The interpretations follow from the data. They follow from a particular reading of the data," she said. "Which is not the same thing." She folded her hands on the desk. "Keth Voren, you are asking the Council to intervene in a territorial dispute between the Maketh hegemony, an 11,000-year member of this community, and a species that has been in space for less than a century. I am asking the Council to uphold the territorial framework that exists, and that the humans followed correctly," I said. "You are asking the Council to choose a side. The law has already chosen a side," I said. "I am asking the Council to notice." She was quiet for a moment. It was a considering quiet, not a dismissive one, which I took as a small good sign. Your historical analysis of the humans, she said finally. You believe it. I do. You believe that this species, which has, as of today, fewer than 30 vessels capable of sustained deep space travel, represents a significant strategic factor in a dispute with the Maketh hegemony, which has 400 warships. I believe, I said carefully, that the number of vessels they have today is not the number of vessels they will have in 1 year, or 2. I believe the Maketh are applying a template they have used successfully against species whose responses are predictable, and I believe that the human response to pressure is not predictable in the way the Maketh are assuming it is. Yevtan looked at me for a long moment. You have been studying them for 15 years, she said. Yes. And your professional assessment, as the senior keeper of this archive and the most thorough scholar of human history outside their own civilization, is that the Maketh are making an error. My professional assessment, I said, is that the Maketh are making an error that no one has survived making before, because no one has made it before. There is no historical precedent for this particular mistake, because humans are a new variable in this galaxy. I paused. That is precisely what makes it difficult to explain to people who rely on precedent. She was quiet again. Longer this time. Then she said something that I did not expect. You mentioned a precursor fragment in your first report. 5 years ago. The fragment from the Velanera salvage. I had mentioned it briefly. As contextual background, I had not emphasized it, because I knew how the codex was received, as historical curiosity, as mythology, as the kind of thing scholars found interesting and administrators found irrelevant. Yes, I said. Is there more to that fragment than you included? I thought about the dim, secure room, the cracked tablet in its case, the words I had memorized years ago and that had not left my mind since. Yes, I said. She looked at me steadily. I would like to read the full content. I had not expected that either. I brought her the complete transcript the following morning. The recovered text, the partial reconstruction, the lines lost to damage marked clearly as absent. She read it in my presence, which I had requested, because I wanted to watch her face. She read slowly. She did not rush the difficult parts. When she reached the final legible passage, they are dangerous because they remember everything, they adapt to anything, and they do not stop. She read it twice. I watched her do it. When she finished, she set the transcript down and looked out her window for a while without speaking. Then she said, the precursors left this specifically. Yes. They went to the trouble of creating a record, in a form designed to survive long periods, addressed to whoever came after them, and the primary subject of that record is this species. The tablet I have is one fragment, I said. The codex suggests there are others. We have not found them. She was quiet for another moment. And your reading of this is that the warning is genuine, not metaphorical, not culturally specific to the precursor frame of reference. The precursors were the most technically and intellectually advanced civilization we have record of, I said. They survived for 90,000 years. They did not traffic in metaphor in their caution records. Every other warning in the codex has been specific, accurate, and verifiable against subsequent history. I have no reason to treat this one differently. Yevtan folded her hands again. She looked at the transcript. She looked at me. I will bring this to the full council, she said, privately, not as a public motion. She paused. I am not promising action, Kethvorin. I am promising discussion. Discussion is more than I had yesterday, I said. She almost smiled. You are relentless, for an archivist. I have been told that, I said. The council discussed my report in private session. I was not present. Vessel Khan told me afterward that the discussion had been thorough, which was his diplomatic way of saying it had been long and contentious, and had not produced agreement. The vote to formally support the human territorial claim at Ardennes Station did not pass. The vote to formally oppose the Maketh pressure sequence did not pass. What passed, by a margin of 23 to 18, was a motion to issue a statement of concern regarding unilateral territorial action in disputed systems, addressed to no party in particular, and therefore binding on no one. It was, as resolutions go, the political equivalent of clearing your throat in a room where someone is shouting. I read the statement 3 times. Then I filed it in the archive under the category I had used before, on a shelf in the lower halls where important things go when they are not quite important enough yet for the rooms upstairs. Then I went to the Human Trade Office in the diplomatic quarter, because I had a meeting scheduled with Henrik Strom about an academic exchange proposal, and because I needed to look at a human being for a few minutes and remember what I was actually worried about. He was in, as he always was. He offered me a cup of something warm that humans drank, which I had learned to accept graciously. He asked me how I was. I said I was well. We talked through the exchange proposal. He was, as always, pleasant and well-prepared, and exactly as stubborn as the situation required. As I was leaving, I paused at the door of his small office. There was a photograph on his wall, a physical printed image, which several of the humans kept in their workspaces. It showed a city rebuilt. I had looked it up once, and I knew what it was. The city his grandfather had grown up in, destroyed and then rebuilt within a single lifetime. The rebuilt version was brighter and larger than the original had been. That city, I said. In the photograph. He looked up. Yes. It was completely destroyed. Yes. He said it simply, the way you say something that is true and that you have made your peace with. And they rebuilt it. They did. He paused. My grandfather always said the hard part wasn't rebuilding. The hard part was deciding to. Once they decided, the rest was just work. I nodded. I said goodnight. I walked back through the diplomatic quarter toward the archive, in the late-season light of Velmora, thinking about a vote that had failed by 5 seats, and a species that had learned, somewhere in its long, difficult history, that once you decided, the rest was just work. The 30 days of the human diplomatic response to the Maketh patrol pass were counting down. I knew, with a certainty I could not entirely explain and did not entirely want to examine, that when those 30 days ended, things would change. I went back to the archive. I went back to the secured room. I stood in front of the cracked tablet one more time. I did not say anything to it. There was nothing to say. I simply stood there, in the quiet, and waited with it. On the 29th day, the Maketh hegemony sent a fleet to Ardennes Station. They sent 400 ships. The next morning, humanity responded. The response was not what anyone in the known galaxy had expected. It was not what I had expected either, and I had expected quite a lot. I was asleep when the alert came through. That is perhaps the most undignified part of this account, that one of the most significant moments in modern galactic history began for me with a small chiming sound from my desk terminal at the 3rd hour of the night, and I stumbled to it in the dark wearing the old cloth wrap I used for sleeping, with one eye still not fully open. The alert was from the long-range sensor network, vessel contact, multiple signatures, origin, human home system and associated settlements. I sat down at the terminal and opened the full report. Then I was completely awake. Let me tell you what the Maketh sent, so you understand what humanity was looking at when they made their decision. 412 warships. These were not patrol vessels or border monitors. Those were what had made the first pass at Ardennes Station. These were dedicated military vessels, the kind the Maketh had built and maintained for centuries, the kind that had settled every territorial dispute the hegemony had engaged in across 11,000 years of expansion. The smallest of them outmassed the largest human vessel currently in service by a factor of 6. The largest Maketh ships in that fleet were ancient by military standards, which in Maketh terms meant they had been refined and upgraded across 400 years of continuous development, until the original design was more tradition than engineering. The fleet had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the Ardennes system in a formation that was, I was told by a military analyst I consulted the following morning, a textbook positioning, widespread, covering all approach vectors, engines oriented to allow rapid repositioning. The Maketh admiral, a career officer named Drev Sorath, who had 40 years of border operations on her record, had placed her ships with the precise, unhurried confidence of someone who had done this many times and had never needed to do more than show up. They had then opened a communication channel to Ardennes Station and transmitted an ultimatum. I have the text of that ultimatum in my records. It was, by Maketh diplomatic standards, not unkind. It acknowledged the human settlement, noted the disputed territorial status of the system, and offered the station's population safe passage to depart within 72 hours. It promised that all personal property could be taken. It promised that no individual would be harmed. It did not promise that the station would still exist after the 72 hours were up. Ardennes Station's population of 4,000 people, including 230 children and one very proud community garden, had 3 days to pack and leave. The station administrator's response was sent within 40 minutes of receiving the ultimatum. I have that text too. It said, "Thank you for your message. We have forwarded it to the Terran Compact government for response. We do not have the authority to make decisions of this nature at the station level. You will hear from our government directly. Please do not take any action against this station or its residents in the meantime. We have families here." That last sentence, "We have families here." I have thought about those 4 words more than almost anything else in this entire story. Not because they were a strategic statement, because they were not. They were simply true, and someone had written them because it felt important that the people pointing weapons at their home should know it. The Terran Compact government's response came not 40 minutes later, but 14 hours later. 14 hours during which, as I would subsequently learn from the monitoring data, the following things happened simultaneously across every human system and settlement. Emergency legislative sessions were convened on 3 separate stations and the home world. A formal request for diplomatic support was filed with the Velshari continuance, addressed directly to the Council, not to me, though I received a copy through my monitoring access. 22 human vessels that had been engaged in various research and survey missions received recall orders and began moving toward rendezvous coordinates. Every orbital construction platform in the human home system switched from standard operating schedules to continuous operation. Reserve personnel across the Terran Compact's small but carefully maintained defense structure were activated, all of this in 14 hours, while the government was also drafting a diplomatic message. I know, because I was watching the public networks through the night, that the human population was also awake, not in panic, in the same settled, current-running under-the-surface way I had seen when the patrol pass happened. There was fear. I would not pretend otherwise. I could see it in what people wrote, but the fear was not in charge. Something else was in charge. Something older and quieter that I did not have a word for in any of the 47 languages I could read, but that I recognized from the histories. The decision had been made. Now it was just work. The official government response, when it came, was transmitted simultaneously to the Maketh fleet at Ardennes, to the Maketh homeworld, to the Velshari Continuance Council, and to 17 other spacefaring civilizations who held diplomatic standing in this region of the galaxy. I read it the moment it crossed my monitoring feed. This is the Terran Compact, speaking on behalf of the people of Ardennes Station and all Terran settlements. The system in which Ardennes Station is located was claimed under valid territorial law, properly filed, and internationally registered. We will not be withdrawing from it. We ask that the Maketh hegemony withdraw their fleet immediately, and agree to resolve this dispute through the proper diplomatic channels that exist for exactly this purpose. We have no desire for conflict. We extend this offer in good faith. You have 48 hours. Short, clean, no qualifications, no softening language, no diplomatic hedging, just the facts and the offer and the number. The Maketh Admiral, I would learn later, read the response and described it to her staff as naive. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the Ardennes system 31 hours after the government response was transmitted. I was at my desk, which is where I had been for most of the past day and a half, surviving on warm broth and the particular energy that comes from paying very close attention to something important. The sensor data was coming through the monitoring network in real time, and I had it open on my main terminal, while I simultaneously fielded a series of increasingly urgent messages from various council members who had apparently decided, now that something was actually happening, that my reports deserved more attention than they had previously received. I did not respond to the council messages immediately. I was watching the sensor data. The human fleet numbered 47 vessels. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, the way I sat with it at my desk at the 4th hour of a sleepless night. 47, against 412. Every military analyst in the monitoring division had run the numbers. The reports landing in my secondary feed were variations on a theme. The human fleet was outnumbered 8-1, outmassed by a factor of between 6 and 20 depending on vessel class, and outgunned by any conventional measure of weapons capability. The monitoring division's duty officer had written, in his situation summary, that the human response was either a demonstration of extraordinary courage or a demonstration of extraordinary miscalculation, and he was not sure which. I thought it was probably neither, but I did not know yet. I was still watching. The human fleet did not drop out of faster-than-light travel inside the system, the way a fleet in a hurry typically would. They dropped out at the outer edge, beyond the Maketh formation, and they paused. For 6 minutes they simply sat there, 47 ships in a configuration I did not immediately recognize, engines at low output, no weapon signatures active. Maketh Admiral Drev Sorath, according to the intercepted communication data that the monitoring network was collecting with the slightly predatory efficiency it reserved for moments like this, told her senior staff that the humans were trying to decide whether to run. I do not think she was a foolish person. I think she was a very experienced person who was looking at a situation through the lens of everything she knew, and what she knew did not include what I knew. She had spent 40 years watching species calculate the odds and make reasonable decisions. She expected the humans to make a reasonable decision. While the Maketh fleet waited, the humans opened a communication channel, not to the Maketh fleet. That is the part that I have described to people afterward, and that consistently produces a moment of silence, because it takes a moment to process. They opened a communication channel to the Maketh homeworld, to the civilian government, not the military command, not the admiral in the field. The government, the elected body, the people who had the authority to make decisions above the admiral's level. Admiral Yara Reyes. She had a different title in the Terran Compact structure, but Admiral translates most cleanly, so I will use it. Spoke for 40 seconds. I have her words memorized. This is Admiral Yara Reyes of the Terran Compact Defense Force. You have positioned a fleet against a civilian settlement that has committed no act of aggression against you. We are here to ensure the safety of that settlement and its 4,000 residents. We do not want this to become something it does not need to become. Withdraw your fleet. Honor the territorial law that both our civilizations have agreed to uphold. This is the last time this offer will be made at this level. Whatever happens in the next 48 hours will be the result of choices made today. We ask you to make the right one. 40 seconds. She spoke for 40 seconds to an entire planetary government, and every word was exactly the right weight. The Maketh government's response took 11 minutes. What they said, in formal diplomatic language, amounted to, "This matter is in the hands of our military command." Admiral Reyes received that response. She was quiet for a moment, according to the communications data, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be uncertain. Then she said to her fleet, "All ships, begin approach." I will not pretend I understood everything that happened in the next 11 minutes, because I did not. Military tactics are not my field, and what the human fleet did in those 11 minutes was, I was told later by analysts who spent months studying the sensor records, among the most technically sophisticated things any fleet in recent galactic history had executed. What I could see, in the sensor data, was this. The 47 human ships moved, but they did not move the way fleets normally move. As a group, in formation, each vessel part of a collective shape. They moved individually, each ship on its own trajectory, and the trajectories were not direct. They were angular, curved, changing. The Maketh formation, which had been designed to cover all approach vectors against a fleet moving like a fleet, suddenly found that it was covering approach vectors that no ship was actually using. The Maketh ships began repositioning. They were fast. 400 years of development made them very fast. But repositioning 412 vessels is a slower process than moving 47, and the human ships were not waiting. The first human weapons fire came 8 minutes into the approach. I watched the signatures on the sensor data, not the fire itself, which the sensors rendered as energy readings, but the results of it. A Maketh vessel at the left edge of the formation lost engine output, not weapons capability, not structural integrity, just engines. It drifted. Then another. Then two more, nearly simultaneously, at the opposite side of the formation. The Maketh returned fire heavily. The sensor data became very loud, very fast, energy signatures stacking on top of each other, the monitoring network's filters struggling to separate the sources. I gripped the edge of my desk without noticing I was doing it. Human ships were hit. I could see that in the data. Power fluctuations, repositioning burns that looked reactive rather than tactical. One vessel that went briefly dark before coming back at reduced output. They were taking damage. They were not unaffected. Anyone who tells you the human fleet sailed through unharmed is not reading the same sensor data I was reading. But they did not stop. The Maketh formation, designed to hold a perimeter, found that holding a perimeter against ships that did not approach the perimeter directly was a different problem than holding a perimeter was supposed to be. Vessels that moved to close one gap opened another. The human ships flowed into those gaps not like a tide, steady, predictable, but like water finding its way through stone. Patient, finding the path. 11 minutes after Admiral Reyes said begin approach, it was over. I stared at the sensor data for a long time before I fully accepted what it was telling me. Of the 412 Maketh ships, 387 were disabled, not destroyed. Their hulls were intact. Their life support systems were intact. Their crews were alive. The targeting, and I say this having reviewed the analysis reports from 6 different military scholars over the following months, was not approximate. It was not the result of good luck or poor Maketh shielding. The human ships had aimed, consistently and across the chaos of an 11-minute engagement, at engines and propulsion systems, at power relays that fed weapons but not life support, at communications arrays that could be taken offline without taking anything else with them. They had fired hundreds of shots in 11 minutes and they had chosen, for each one, what to disable rather than what to destroy. 3 Maketh vessels were destroyed, not disabled. Gone. Those 3 were the ships that had, during the engagement, fired on a human transport that had been running an evacuation route from Ardennes Station to a safe distance. A transport carrying civilians who had chosen to leave during the diplomatic window. Not a warship, a transport. For those 3 ships, the precision was exactly the same. The choice was just different. I sat with that for a long time. Admiral Reyes transmitted to the Maketh homeworld again after the engagement. This transmission was longer than the first. She described the situation clearly. The fleet was disabled, the crews were unharmed, the station was secure. She offered immediate medical assistance to any Maketh vessel that needed it. Then she said this: "We did not come here to destroy your fleet. We came here to protect our people." Your ships and your crews will be returned to you when we have a framework for resolving this dispute properly. We are still willing to talk. We were always willing to talk. That offer has not changed." She paused. "We would like to begin those conversations soon. The people on Ardennes Station would like to go back to their lives. I imagine your crews would like to go home. Let's make that happen." I read that transmission 3 times. I had read a great deal of human history. I had read their records of their worst conflicts, the ones that had burned whole continents and left generations broken. I knew what they were capable of when they decided a thing needed doing. And here was their admiral, after 11 minutes that had just demonstrated that capability to the entire watching galaxy, asking to talk. Not from weakness, not from exhaustion, from exactly the same place the determination had come from. I thought about Marin Solis and her physical pen. I thought about Callum Park at the entrance of the archive. I thought about Henrik Strom's photograph, and once they decided, the rest was just work. I thought about the grandmother who had written, "They will need to do better than that." They had needed to do better. They had not done better. And now 4,000 people on Ardennes Station, including 230 children and 1 community garden, were safe. My terminal had been accumulating messages through the night: council members, diplomatic officials, 2 journalists from the Velshari Public Record Service, Drev Yasin, who simply sent a message that said, "I read your report." I should have paid more attention. I did not answer any of them immediately. I sat in my office in the early light of Velmora's morning, with the sensor data still open on my terminal, and I wrote in my personal log. I wrote for a long time. Near the end I wrote this: "The Maketh thought they were sending a fleet to move a settlement. They were not. They were sending a fleet to find out what humanity actually was. Now they know. Now we all know. The question is whether the rest of the galaxy will understand what they learned today, or whether they will only see the numbers, 47 ships against 400, and miss the point entirely." I paused. Then I added, "The point is not that they won. The point is how. The point is what they aimed at, and what they did not aim at, and the fact that they knew the difference and chose, in the middle of everything, to hold to it." I closed the log. I looked at the window. Outside, Velmora was going about its morning. The transit lines were running. The market quarter was opening. Ships were docking and departing from the outer platforms. The ordinary traffic of a civilization that had not fully understood yet that something had changed in the night. I thought about a cracked tablet in a sealed case 2 floors above me. An 85,000-year-old warning from the wisest civilization this galaxy had ever produced. Do not wake them. I thought about Admiral Reyes, offering medical assistance to the fleet she had just disabled. Do not wake them. I thought about the 3 ships that were not disabled. Do not wake them. The Maketh had woken them, loudly, and in front of everyone. I did not know yet what would come next, but I knew, with the cold and quiet certainty of a person who has spent decades reading the record of what this species does when it is in motion, that it would not be small. And I knew something else, which I had not let myself fully think until now. Sitting in the early light with the long night finally over, the Velshari had abstained. We had voted on a statement of concern addressed to no one. We had filed it in the lower halls. We had watched. The humans knew we had watched. I was fairly certain Admiral Reyes was a person who remembered things. Somewhere on Ardennes Station, a woman in the community garden was pulling a plant that had been knocked over by the vibration of the station's defense systems activating. She straightened it carefully, pressed the soil back around the roots, and stepped back to check that it was standing properly. Then she went inside to call her family and tell them she was fine. The garden survived. Everything else was just beginning. The galaxy did not go quiet after Ardennes. It did the opposite. In the days following the engagement, every diplomatic channel in the monitoring network was running at capacity. Species that had not spoken to each other in years were suddenly finding reasons to open communications. Ambassadors who normally moved at the deliberate pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be, were requesting emergency audiences. The Velshari Continuance Council, which had passed a toothless resolution and gone back to its regular schedule, convened an emergency session within 48 hours of the sensor data being confirmed and verified. I attended that session. I sat in the observer gallery and watched 39 council members try to discuss something they did not have an existing framework for discussing. The problem was not that they did not understand what had happened. The sensor data was clear. The numbers were clear. 47 ships had disabled 387 ships in 11 minutes, with a precision that every military analyst who reviewed the data described, in various ways, as remarkable. The problem was that understanding what had happened and understanding what it meant were 2 very different things, and the council was much better at the first than the second. Councillor Yev Tan was the only member of the session who said something I found worth writing down. She waited until the initial round of analysis and reaction had run its course. Waited through the alarmed voices and the dismissive voices and the voices trying to find a category this fit into, And then she said, in the particular quiet that experienced council members use when they want a room to actually listen, "We are asking the wrong question. We are asking what the humans did. We should be asking what the Maketh thought the humans would do. And then we should ask ourselves whether we thought the same thing." The room was briefly silent. Then someone else started talking, and the moment passed, but I wrote it down. My personal log from those weeks is not orderly. I am usually a methodical writer, one thought at a time, organized, structured. The log from that period reads like something written by a person who is walking faster than they can think, which is more or less accurate. I was monitoring 12 separate channels simultaneously. I was answering requests from council members who now wanted briefings on human history that they had not wanted 3 weeks ago. I was responding to academic inquiries from scholars across 5 civilizations who had suddenly developed an urgent interest in the precursor caution records. I was also, in the hours between everything else, continuing to follow the human public networks, because those networks were where I had always found the clearest picture of what was actually happening inside the human civilization, beneath the layer of official statements and diplomatic language. What was happening in those weeks after Ardennes was this: the humans were not celebrating. That surprised me, though I think it should not have. I had read enough of their history to know that they were not a simple people, but I had half expected, the way you half expect things even when your evidence tells you otherwise, some version of triumph. Public celebration, speeches, the pageantry that most species indulge in after a significant military victory. There was none of that. Or rather, there was relief, enormous, visible, genuine relief that the people on Ardennes Station were safe. But it was quiet relief. Personal. Families calling each other. People on the public networks posting images of the station's residents going about their normal routines, with small written notes that amounted to variations of, "They are okay and thank goodness." The garden appeared in several of those posts. Someone on the station had taken a photograph of it the morning after the engagement, standing in the early artificial light of the station's sunrise cycle, and the image spread across the human networks faster than almost anything else from those days. Just a garden. Rows of green things growing under warm light, slightly lopsided from the vibration, but present and alive. I saved that image. I still have it. The official statements from the Terran Compact government were measured and careful. They expressed satisfaction that the station was secure. They reiterated the offer to return Maketh vessels and crews under a negotiated framework. They stated clearly and repeatedly that the Compact sought a diplomatic resolution and considered the military action a defensive measure, not a statement of intent. They also, in the same official statements, announced something that I had been watching for in the monitoring data and had seen coming before anyone else. The expansion of construction operations across every human orbital platform was not slowing down. It was accelerating. I need to tell you about the Aceric Compact, because they matter to what came next, and because understanding them matters to understanding what the humans did about them, which is one of the most instructive things in this entire account. The Aceric were an old civilization, not as old as the Velshari, not as old as the Maketh, but old enough to have developed the kind of institutional confidence that age produces. They were a careful people, methodical and measured, who had built their civilization on a foundation of what they called rational expansion. They moved into new territory only when they had calculated that the benefit outweighed the risk, and they calculated very thoroughly before moving. They had watched Ardennes with the same attention as everyone else, and what they had calculated, watching it, was this. The humans had demonstrated significant military capability against the Maketh, but the Maketh fleet had been caught in a static defensive posture, which was a tactically vulnerable position. The Maketh had not fought like a fleet that expected to need to fight. They had fought like a fleet that expected its presence to be sufficient. The Aceric calculated that a fleet which expected to fight would perform differently. They also calculated that the human fleet, having just engaged in a significant action, would be dealing with damage assessment, repair operations, and the logistical demands of managing 387 disabled Maketh vessels. They would be stretched, occupied, momentarily less capable of responding to a second front. The Aceric had a territorial interest in 2 systems adjacent to the growing edge of human expansion. They had been watching those systems for years, waiting for the right moment to press their claim. They calculated that this was the right moment. I found out about their decision through the monitoring network 40 hours before they acted on it. The signal was subtle, a change in the patrol patterns of Aceric border vessels, a series of supply requisitions that did not match standard operational needs, a small cluster of encrypted communications between their military command and their outer station commanders. I had been reading alien civilizations for 60 years. I knew what preparation looked like. I wrote an emergency brief and sent it to the full council within the hour. I also, and this was outside my formal role, which I acknowledged in a footnote and did not apologize for, sent a copy directly to the human diplomatic office on Velmora. Henrik Strom received it. He read it within 20 minutes of my sending it. Because it was the middle of his working day and he was always at his desk during his working day, he sent me a response that said, "Thank you, Archivist. This is very helpful. We'll take it from here." 4 words at the end. Simple. Calm. 32 hours later, I saw the first signs in the monitoring data that the human fleet had repositioned. They had not moved away from Ardennes. They had split. Part of the fleet remained at Ardennes, managing the Maketh situation. The rest, 21 ships, which had been quietly detached from the main group in a way that the Aceric monitoring systems apparently did not catch, or did not catch in time, had moved to a position between the Ceric border fleet and the systems the Ceric intended to enter. They were waiting when the Ceric arrived. What happened at the Aceric border was different from Ardennes in ways I found, if anything, more striking than the original engagement. There was no battle. The Ceric fleet came out of faster-than-light travel and found 21 human ships in a formation that blocked their intended route. The human ships were not moving aggressively. They were simply present, engines at standard output, in the right place. The Aceric fleet commander opened communications immediately. Admiral Reyes, who I had come to understand did not sleep very much, or if she did, she slept in places where she could still receive communications, responded personally. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. I have the transcript. I have read it many times. She did not threaten. She did not raise her voice. She did not describe what had happened at Ardennes in detail, because she did not need to. The Aceric commander had been watching the same sensor data as everyone else. What she did was explain. She described the human territorial claims, their legal basis, the process by which they had been filed. She described the compact's position, that they were not looking to expand aggressively, that they had specific settled claims they intended to protect, and that those claims did not include territory the Aceric had any reasonable historical basis to contest. Then she said something I read 3 times in the transcript before I understood it fully. She said, "Commander, I think you made a calculation about timing and opportunity. I understand why. It looked reasonable from the outside, but I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is more useful here than posturing. The timing was not what it looked like. We were not stretched thin. We were watching. We are always watching. And we move faster than the gap you were trying to use. I am not saying this to intimidate you. I am saying it because I would rather you know the truth now than discover it under worse circumstances later." The Aceric commander was silent for a notable pause. Then he said he needed to consult with his government. Reyes told him to take all the time he needed. She would be right here. He consulted with his government for 4 hours. The 21 human ships waited. No aggressive posture. No escalating signals. They waited with the patience of people who had nowhere else to be, which I knew was not true but which they projected with remarkable consistency. The Aceric fleet turned around. The Maketh hegemony, watching the Ceric situation from the middle of their own crisis, sent a communication to the Terran Compact government 48 hours after the Aceric withdrawal. It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that. 11,000-year-old civilizations, with strong cultural traditions around dignity and standing, do not apologize easily. And the Maketh did not apologize here. What they sent was a request. A formal request to begin negotiations regarding a framework for the return of their fleet and the establishment of a proper territorial dispute process. It was, in every meaningful way, exactly what Admiral Reyes had offered them before the engagement at Ardennes. The offer they had declined. The offer that had been on the table from the beginning. They were asking for it now, and they were asking in a way that acknowledged, without quite saying so, that they were asking rather than demanding, which was new for the Maketh in a border situation, and which I noted carefully in my records. The Terran Compact government accepted the request within 6 hours. I watched the council session that reviewed this development. Vessel Khan, who had recovered his equilibrium somewhat after the initial shock of Ardennes, described the human response as strategically sophisticated. Yev Tan, who was sitting 2 seats to his left, said nothing, but I saw her write something in her personal notes, and I would have very much liked to know what it was. The emergency sessions, the diplomatic flurry, the analyst reports, all of that was the visible surface of those weeks. What I was actually watching, underneath it, was the thing that mattered more. I was watching what the broader human population was doing. Not the government, not the military, not the official statements. The people. They were building. The orbital platforms were running continuously, and the construction data that came through the monitoring network, which tracked energy signatures, material shipments, structural mass increases, told a story that I do not think anyone in the council had looked at as carefully as I had. The human fleet that had gone to Ardennes was 47 ships. The construction underway would produce, at the rates I was tracking, enough new hulls to double that number within 8 months. Within 18 months it would triple. And this was construction that had begun before Ardennes. The Maketh action had not started it. It had already been in progress, quietly, steadily, the way things are built by people who have decided on a direction and are simply doing the work. I thought about what Drev Yasin had said about the arsenal principle in my report, the way human industrial capacity scaled when pressed. But what I was watching was not scaling under pressure. This was baseline. This was the pace they moved at when nothing particular was pushing them. It was, by any standard I had available for comparison, extraordinary. I wrote a new report, longer than the previous ones, more detailed. I included the construction data, the fleet projection figures, the comparison with their historical industrial scaling rates. I included a section on the aceric engagement that I titled, Restraint as Strategy, because I wanted the council to understand that the 22-minute conversation that had turned a fleet around was not a lucky outcome. It was a chosen one. Admiral Reyes had had the ability to engage and had chosen to speak instead, and the speaking had worked precisely because the ability to engage was clearly and visibly present. The power to act and the choice not to. I had seen that combination in the historical record of almost no other civilization. Most species, when they had the advantage, used it completely. The humans had used exactly as much of it as the situation required, and no more. That was not instinct. That was discipline. The kind of discipline that comes from a very long history of learning, the hard way, exactly where the line is. I ended the report with a section I had been thinking about for weeks. I called it What They Are Building Toward. I wrote, based on current construction rates, fleet development projections, and the diplomatic frameworks being established through the Ardennes negotiations, I believe the Terran Compact is not building a war fleet. They are building a deterrent. The distinction is important, and I do not believe the Council is making it clearly enough. A war fleet is built to attack. A deterrent is built so that attacking becomes a choice no rational party will make. The humans went to Ardennes with 47 ships against 400 because they had calculated, correctly, that 47 ships of their design and capability were sufficient for that specific situation. They are not building 2,000 ships because they plan to use 2,000 ships. They are building 2,000 ships so that no one will ever again perform the calculation the Maketh performed and arrive at the same answer the Maketh did. I submitted the report. I did not expect it to be filed in the lower halls this time. It was not. Yevtan called me to her office again. She looked, I thought, like a person who had been sleeping less than usual. The Maketh negotiations are progressing, she said. The Sarek have opened a parallel diplomatic channel. The Compact's ambassador has requested a formal meeting with the full council next month. I know, I said. I monitor those channels. I know you do. She looked at me steadily. Your report. The section on deterrence. Yes, you believe it. I do. You are saying that the humans are not a threat in the traditional sense. You are saying they are building a structure that makes conflict against them irrational. I am saying, I said carefully, that they have done this before. Not in space. On their own world. In their own history. They built these structures after every major conflict, and the structures kept collapsing, because the technology was insufficient, and the reach was limited. They now have reach they never had before. I paused. They are very good at learning from what has not worked. It is, as far as I can determine from the historical record, one of their primary skills. Yevtan was quiet for a moment, then she said, the council is going to ask you to present to the full session, not a written report, in person. I had not expected that. When? I said. 3 weeks. Before the Compact ambassador's visit, she looked out her window. We need to understand what we are sitting down across from. I believe you are the only person in this building who actually does. I thought about 63 years in the archive. The dead civilizations on the long silver shelves. The 14 species that had risen and gone quiet. The cracked tablet in the sealed case 2 floors up. I will prepare, I said. She nodded. Then she said something that surprised me, coming from her. Yevtan, who was always precise, always measured, always the one sanding the sharp points smooth. She said, I voted against your recommendation. At Ardennes, I voted with the majority. I know, I said. I would not vote the same way again. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which felt right. She turned back to her window. Prepare thoroughly, Archivist. The council is finally ready to listen. That night I went to the secured room one more time. The tablet was where it always was. The cracks were the same. The dark section where the text had been lost was the same. Nothing had changed about it in 15 years. I stood in front of it and thought about the precursors. I thought about what it must have been like to be the oldest civilization in the galaxy, to have seen everything there was to see, and to decide that of all the things worth carving into a surface designed to outlast you by tens of thousands of years, This was the most important. Not a warning about the civilizations that would have fleets of thousands. Not a warning about species with weapons that could move stars. A warning about a small, soft-fleshed creature from a mostly water world with one pale moon, who built gardens on space stations, and signed treaties with physical pens, and turned entire fleets around with 22-minute conversations. I thought about the Maketh, who had come with 400 ships and woken up a morning later asking to talk. I thought about the Sarek, who had run a careful calculation and then turned around when they found out the calculation was wrong. I thought about 2,000 ships being built in quiet orbital platforms, steadily, without fanfare, by people who were not angry, simply working. And I thought about what I was going to say to the council in 3 weeks. I thought about it for a long time, standing in the dim light of the secure room, in front of a message from the wisest people who had ever lived. Then I went to my office and began to write. Not the report, not yet. First I wrote one line in my personal log. They are not building toward war. They are building toward a galaxy where the question of war, when it concerns them, becomes one that no rational mind will ask. I looked at that line for a while. Then I added, the precursors were right. They are not dangerous in the way other dangerous things are dangerous. They are dangerous the way gravity is dangerous. Quietly, constantly, and in a direction that only becomes clear when it is already too late to choose a different path. I closed the log. Outside, Velmora was dark and quiet, the station's night cycle in its 3rd hour. Somewhere, in orbital platforms across a human system I had never visited and might never visit, people were working through their own night, building the thing they had decided needed to be built. I thought about Marin Solis, the very first one I had met, who had walked off a ship and smiled at a room full of strangers as though she had always known she would find them here. I thought, the Maketh woke them. The Sarek tested them. Neither of them had understood the answer they got. In 3 weeks I would try to explain it to the council. In simple language, clearly, without hedging. I owed them that. I owed it to everyone in this part of the galaxy who had not been paying attention and needed to start. And I owed it, I thought, to the humans themselves. We'd rather be understood than assumed about. I intended to make sure they were. I had given presentations before. In 63 years of archive work, I had stood in front of academic panels, diplomatic committees, research boards, and once a very large public gathering that had wanted to hear about the Durath civilization's collapse, which turned out to be a more popular topic than I had expected. I was not a nervous speaker. I knew how to organize information, how to move through a complex argument without losing the thread, how to read a room and adjust when attention was drifting. But I had never stood in front of the full council of the Velshari continuance and said, everything you think you know about this situation is incomplete, and I am going to spend the next 2 hours correcting that. That is not, of course, how I phrased it. I phrased it as follows. I would like to offer the council a complete picture of the species we are about to formally receive as a diplomatic partner. Not the picture we have in the standard catalog, the complete one. Yevtan had arranged for me to have the full session time, 41 council members in their seats, in the circular chamber with the high ceiling and the long windows that looked out over Velmora's central district, morning light, good acoustics. Every terminal in the room open to my prepared materials. I began at the beginning, not the beginning of the current situation, the beginning of the humans, their world, their early history, the long, slow climb from simple settlements to complex civilization. I did not rush it. I knew some members of the council would be impatient with historical background, and I did not care, because the historical background was the entire point. You cannot understand where something is without knowing where it came from. That is the first principle of archive work, and it is the first principle of understanding any civilization. I talked about their recoveries. I laid the pattern out plainly, the collapses and the rebuildings, each one tracked against the timeline, the data showing not just that they survived, but how quickly, how completely, and what they looked like afterward compared to what they had looked like before. I showed them the arsenal numbers, the scaling rates from their historical conflicts, presented as a graph that several council members leaned forward to look at more closely. I talked about the precursor fragment. I had brought a full display rendering of the recovered text, and I read it aloud in the council chamber, in my own voice, slowly. The chamber was very quiet when I finished reading it. I talked about Ardennes, not the tactical analysis, they had all read that, but the choices within Ardennes, the 48-hour offer, the message to the civilian government rather than the military command, the targeting during the engagement, the offer of medical assistance afterward. I laid each choice beside the capability that made a different choice possible, and I asked the council, plainly, to consider what it meant that a species with that capability had made those choices consistently, under pressure, in the middle of an active military engagement. I talked about the Aseric. I played the audio from the 22-minute conversation, with a text rendering available on the terminals. Several members listened with the particular still attention of people hearing something for the first time that they will be thinking about for a long time afterward. Then I talked about the construction platforms. I showed the data. The current numbers, the projection curves, the comparison with historical human industrial scaling rates. I showed where the fleet would be in 8 months, in 18 months, in 3 years at current pace. I showed the Council what the Terran Compact's defense capacity would look like at the end of that period, against any force in this region of the galaxy. Then I said what I had written in my personal log, but in plainer language. They are not building this to use it. They are building it so that no one will make the calculation the Maketh made. So that no one will make the calculation the Aseric made. So that the answer to the question, can we push the humans off this settlement, this system, this claim they have filed legally and correctly, is so obviously and immediately no that the question stops being asked. I paused. The Velshari continuance has maintained its position in this galaxy for 40,000 years through neutrality, through record-keeping, through being useful to everyone, and threatening to no one. That has worked because the civilizations around us were broadly rational actors who valued stability. What I am telling you today is that a new kind of stability is being built by a species that has learned, through its own very difficult history, that the only lasting peace is the kind that is not worth breaking. They are not a threat to that stability. They may, in time, be its primary guarantor. I stopped there. I had more I could have said. I chose not to. A good presentation, like a good document, ends when the essential thing has been said, and not a moment later. The chamber was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then Councillor Yevtan said, "Questions for the archivist." There were many questions. The session ran 2 hours over the scheduled time. I answered every one. The Terran Compact ambassador arrived on Velmora 12 days after my council presentation. Her name was Dr. Lena Vasquez, and she was not a military figure. She was a scholar, which I found interesting. A historian, specifically, which I found even more interesting. She had written extensively on interspecies contact theory, and had, I discovered from reviewing her published work beforehand, cited Velshari archive documents in several of her papers. She had been using our public collection for years from a distance. She walked through the archive's entrance hall on the morning after her arrival and stood in exactly the same place Callum Park had stood 7 years earlier, looking at the same long silver shelves with the same expression of overwhelmed reverence. I was there again. I am not sure whether that was coincidence or whether I had been hoping for it. "You must be the archivist," she said. "I must be," I said. She smiled. It was a different kind of smile from Marin Solis's uncomplicated delight or Callum Park's hungry reverence. It was the smile of someone who has spent a long time studying something from the outside and is only now standing inside it. Careful, almost disbelieving. The smile of a scholar who has just found the primary source. "I've read everything you've published on precursor settlement patterns," she said. "The paper on the Outer Meridian survey sites was extraordinary. Your argument about the intentional scattering of the caution records, that they placed fragments in multiple locations as a redundancy measure. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I had not expected that." I was quiet for a moment, which does not happen to me very often. "You have read my academic work," I said. "Most of it," she said. "You're one of the foremost precursor scholars in the known galaxy." She said it simply, as a fact, without the particular weight that compliments usually carry when people want something from you. Then she looked back at the shelves. "I'd very much like to see the fragment you recovered, if that's possible." I considered that for a moment. Then I said, "Come with me." I took her to the secured room. I had not brought anyone there before. Not Reskaveth, who had found the tablet and whose life had changed in smaller ways than mine because of it. Not Drev Yasin, who had read my notes but not the source. Not Yev Tan, who had read the transcript I brought to her office. No one had stood in this room with me and the tablet in 15 years. Dr. Vasquez stood in front of the sealed case and looked at the tablet for a long time without speaking. She studied the cracks, the dark section, the partial text visible through the case's transparent face. She leaned in close and read slowly. Then she straightened up and said, "The scattering theory. You've found another one, haven't you?" It was not quite a question. "A partial," I said. "Recovered 8 years ago from a different site. 3 legible lines, different section of the record. I have not published it yet. The reconstruction work is ongoing." "What do those lines say?" "I had them memorized. I had everything in this room memorized." I said, "They say, their grief does not break them. We have watched species destroyed by loss, brought to a stopping point from which they do not return. This one transforms what breaks them into what drives them. We do not fully understand how. We record it because we believe it is the most important thing about them." Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, "The precursors didn't fully understand us either. No, I said. They did not. They observed. They recorded. They warned. But they wrote, in that fragment, that they did not fully understand the mechanism. Only the outcome. She looked at the tablet again. And you? After 15 years of studying us, do you understand the mechanism? I thought about that question carefully. It deserved a careful answer. I understand the pattern, I said. You carry your losses. You do not set them down. You convert them into something, into determination, into memorials, into the absolute insistence that the thing that broke you will not break you again. I can see the pattern clearly across your entire recorded history. I paused. Whether that constitutes understanding the mechanism, I am genuinely not certain. She was quiet again. Then she said, my grandmother survived something very bad, early in her life, before I was born. She never talked about it directly, but she built things her entire life afterward. A school, a community center, a garden that people in her town still maintain. She died at 92 and she was still planting things the year she died. She paused. I used to think that was just who she was. Then I became a historian, and I started seeing it everywhere, in every period, in every culture. People who have been through the worst things possible, and come out the other side building something. She turned to look at me. It's not complicated, archivist. It's just that when you have seen how quickly everything can be taken, you understand the value of what you are making. You don't build slowly or carelessly. You build like it matters because you know that it does. I stood in the dim light of the secured room and looked at the cracked tablet and thought about 40,000 years of archive work and the 14 civilizations on the long silver shelves. I thought about the Turith, who had left one phrase carved on a station hull. We were here and we were glad. I thought about what Dr. Vasquez's grandmother had planted. I did not say anything for a while. Neither did she. We stood in the quiet together, which felt entirely appropriate. The formal diplomatic session began 3 days after her arrival. I was present as an observer and, for the first time, as a formal consultant. Yev Tan had given me that designation the week before, which meant my assessments would be entered into the official record rather than filed in my personal log. The session covered a great deal of ground: the framework for the Maketh negotiations, the parallel channel with the SERIC, trade agreements, research exchange programs, a proposal for a joint historical commission that would pool archive resources with human scholarship, Dr. Vasquez's proposal, which she had clearly been planning for years, because the documentation she presented was immaculate. But the moment I remember most clearly from that session came near the end, when Vessel Khan asked a question that I believe he had been working up to for some time. He said, Ambassador, I would like to ask something directly. The Velshari abstained from supporting your claim at Ardennes. We issued a resolution that affected nothing. We watched rather than acted. I would like to know how your government views that. The room was very still. Dr. Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then she said, we noted it. 2 words, the same calm weight that Admiral Reyes used. Not threatening, not forgiving, not dismissing, simply accurate. A fact, stated plainly. We noted it. Vessel Khan held her gaze, and we are here, she said, having this conversation, building this framework. She folded her hands on the table. We are not a civilization that ends relationships because they began imperfectly. We have too much history with imperfect beginnings to believe that they determine the ending. She paused. But we do remember, and what we are building, in these sessions and in others like them, is a structure in which abstaining becomes harder to choose. Not because we will punish abstention, but because the framework we are building together will make the cost of it visible in advance. She looked around the table. We would prefer that the continuance be a genuine partner. We think you would prefer that too, so let's build something worth being part of. The silence after that was different from other silences I had sat in during diplomatic sessions. It was not the silence of people unsure how to respond. It was the silence of people absorbing something they would be thinking about for a long time. I wrote in my notes, she has her grandmother's quality. Building like it matters because she knows it does. The Maketh negotiations took 4 months. They were not easy. 11,000-year-old civilizations with deep traditions around standing and dignity do not renegotiate their relationship with a younger species in a comfortable or graceful way. There were sessions that ended without agreement. There were proposals that were rejected and counter-proposals that required extensive revision. There were 3 separate moments when the process appeared to be collapsing and did not, because the human negotiating team, led by a patient, precise man named Ambassador Kofi Asante, who I eventually concluded might be one of the most skilled diplomats I had ever observed, had prepared for each apparent collapse and had something ready to offer that changed the direction. I watched every session I was permitted to attend. I studied Ambassador Asante the way I had studied Marin Solis and Dr. Vasquez and Admiral Reyes. looking for the pattern, trying to understand the mechanism beneath the observable behavior. What I found, watching him across 4 months of difficult negotiation, was this. He never tried to win. That is not an obvious thing to say about a negotiator, because the assumption is that negotiation is about winning. Vessel Khan negotiated to win, to secure the best outcome for the Velshari position. Every experienced diplomat I had watched over the years negotiated to win, because that is what diplomacy is in the end. Asante negotiated to build. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. When the Maketh made a concession, he did not press the advantage. He acknowledged it and offered something in return. Not because he had to, but because he was constructing a record, session by session, of an interaction in which both parties gave things, and both parties received things. He was building the story of this negotiation as much as he was building the agreement, because he understood that the story would outlast the specific terms, and the story needed to be one that the Maketh could live with over a very long time. By the end of the 4th month, the Maketh fleet had been returned. Fully, with genuine ceremony on both sides. The territorial framework had been established. The dispute process had been formalized. The Maketh delegation, in the final session, made a statement that I noted carefully in my records. They said that while the circumstances of this negotiation had not been of their choosing, the outcome was one they could endorse as fair. From the Maketh, that was as close to an acknowledgement as the situation was going to produce. Asante accepted it with complete seriousness, without any trace of visible satisfaction, which was either exceptional self-control or genuine grace, and I was not certain which. Possibly both. The Aceric resolution was faster and in some ways more remarkable. The Aceric commander who had turned his fleet around after 22 minutes with Admiral Reyes was a man named Vel Karath. He had returned to his government and apparently filed a report of his own, because 2 months after the withdrawal, the Aceric Compact opened a formal diplomatic channel with the Terran Compact and made a proposal that no one had anticipated. They wanted to join the negotiating framework, not as a party to the existing dispute that involved the Maketh and the humans, and the Aceric had the honesty to acknowledge they had no standing there. They wanted to participate in the broader territorial framework being developed. They wanted to be part of the structure. Admiral Reyes, in the recorded communication where she received this proposal, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Commander Vel Karath, is that who I'm speaking with?" "It is," he said. "Then I'm glad to hear from you again." She paused. "Yes, we welcome that. We have one condition," he said. "What condition?" She said, "That you tell us what made you turn around. Not in diplomatic language. What actually made you turn around?" Another pause. Then Vel Karath said something I have thought about many times. He said, "You told us the truth when you did not have to. You told us our calculation was wrong when you could simply have shown us it was wrong. The difference between those two choices is, it matters. It matters what kind of civilization does which of those things." He paused. "We want to build things with the kind that tells the truth." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Welcome to the framework, Commander." I was not in that conversation. I read the transcript 2 days later, in my office, in the late afternoon light. I read it 3 times. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. I had spent 63 years in the archive, surrounded by the records of species that had risen and fallen and gone quiet. I had read their last broadcasts, their final records, the things they had wanted to say before silence took them. I had catalogued their endings with care and respect, and the particular weight that comes from knowing that no one is coming to add more to these shelves. 14 civilizations, on the long silver shelves. And here was a new one, young, brief, soft-fleshed, from a mostly water world, building a framework, session by session, that was making the galaxy more stable simply by being itself, by telling the truth when it did not have to, by aiming at engines instead of crews, by turning fleets around with conversations instead of weapons, by planting gardens on space stations, and treating the fact that they had to defend those gardens not as a victory to celebrate, but as a problem that should not have required defending in the first place. I opened my personal log. I wrote, "The 14 on the shelves went quiet for many reasons. Some overreached, some collapsed inward, some simply ran out of whatever had kept them going. I have spent my career studying their endings, and I have never been able to find a common cause, except perhaps this. They all, at some point, stopped building toward something and started defending what they had. The shift is subtle when it happens, but it is always there, in the record, if you know where to look." I stopped. I read what I had written. Then I wrote, "I do not think the humans will make that shift. Not because they are perfect. They are not, and they know it better than anyone. But because they have been at the edge of ending too many times to ever mistake what they have built for something permanent. They build because they know it can be taken. They remember because they know it can happen again. They reach outward because stopping has never, in their entire history, kept them safe. I closed the log. Outside, the evening was settling over Velmora. I thought about the council presentation I had given, and the questions that had run 2 hours over schedule, and Yevtan saying the council is finally ready to listen. I thought about Dr. Vasquez standing in the secured room, saying it's not complicated, archivist. I thought about Ambassador Asante building a story as carefully as he built an agreement. I thought about the Aceric commander saying we want to build things with the kind that tells the truth. And I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the precursors, the wisest civilization this galaxy had ever produced, leaving their most important warning for whoever came after them. They had called it a warning. They had titled the collection, The Caution Records. But sitting in my office in the evening light, after 4 months of watching what these people actually did with the power they were building, I found myself wondering whether the precursors had meant it as a warning at all, or whether they had meant it as something else entirely, something closer to hope. The Maketh fleet returned home in proper formation, repaired and whole, crews intact. The Aceric delegation arrived on Velmora 3 weeks later and filed their participation papers with the Framework Commission. On Ardennes Station, the community garden produced its first full harvest. Someone sent a photograph of it to the human public networks. It spread very quickly, the way good things sometimes do. The caption, written by the station administrator in her own hand, said only, "We are still here. I am old now." That is not a complaint. It is simply a fact, stated the way I have always preferred facts, plainly without decoration. I am old. My claws shake when I write for too long, and I have to take the slower transit line to the archive because the fast one has a vibration that my joints no longer appreciate. My staff have learned not to schedule my difficult meetings before the second hour of the morning, because it takes me longer than it used to for my mind to reach the sharpness I need for difficult things. But my mind does reach it, that I want to be clear about. I am not writing this from memory loss or confusion or the soft blurring that takes some people at the end of their years. I am writing this from the fullest clarity I have ever had, which is the clarity that comes when you have watched something unfold across decades and you finally, in the quiet of your own late years, understand what you were watching. It has been 31 years since Reskaveth put a cracked tablet on my desk. It has been 21 years since Marin Solis walked off the terra firma and smiled at a room full of strangers. It has been 16 years since Ardennes. And it is this morning that I am sitting in my office, in the chair I have occupied for so long that the shape of me is pressed into it permanently, looking at a document that was delivered to my desk an hour ago by a young human researcher named Tariq who works in the Archives Exchange Program, and who handed it to me with both hands, very carefully, the way Reskaveth once handed me a tablet he did not fully understand. History has a sense of form, if you watch it long enough. Let me tell you what the world looks like now, because context matters, and because I have spent my entire life believing that you cannot understand a moment without knowing what surrounds it. The Maketh hegemony no longer exists in the form it had for 11,000 years. What exists now is the Maketh protectorate. Same world, same people, same extraordinary architecture and complex cuisine, and centuries of mathematical contribution to galactic scholarship. But the hegemony's structure of expansion, the slow, steady outward pressure that had always been its method and its identity, is gone. Not because it was destroyed, but because the framework that the Terran Compact built, patiently and with Ambassador Asante's characteristic commitment to giving both parties something to be proud of, made the expansion model simply impractical. When every territorial claim must be filed correctly, reviewed by an independent commission, and held accountable to a framework that 17 civilizations have signed, the old method of arriving with a fleet and calling it a negotiation stops working. The Maketh, to their genuine credit, adapted. They are still proud. They should be. Their history is extraordinary, and the Compact never once asked them to be ashamed of it. What changed was the method, and the method was only ever a tool. The Maketh turned out to have other tools, and some of those tools were very good ones. They are now among the strongest contributors to the Joint Historical Commission that Dr. Vasquez proposed in that first diplomatic session. The commission has 43 members and produces research that I read with genuine admiration. 3 of the finest precursor scholars I know are Maketh. I find that particularly satisfying. The Aceric Compact became something no one had predicted at the time, including me. Velkarath, the commander who turned his fleet around after 22 minutes and said we want to build things with the kind that tells the truth, eventually left military service and entered his government's diplomatic structure. He rose steadily, with the same patient competence he had apparently shown in uniform, and 12 years ago he was elected to lead the Aceric Governing Council. He has held that position since, which is unusual in Aceric politics, where leadership typically rotates more quickly. Under his leadership, The Aceric have become what I think of as the framework's most enthusiastic members. They participate in every commission, every joint initiative, every diplomatic structure the Compact proposes. They send their young people to study at human institutions. They have opened 3 permanent cultural exchange stations. They are building something, steadily and with purpose, and watching them do it reminds me of something I cannot quite put into words except to say, they learned from the right example. The Terran Compact itself has changed in ways I find both expected and surprising. The fleet I watched being built, all those years ago, the 2,000 ships that were never meant to be used, is now larger than that, and has been used, though sparingly, and with the same careful precision that has characterized every human military action I have observed. There have been 3 situations in 16 years where the presence of that fleet resolved a dispute before it became a conflict. In each case, the resolution came from a conversation rather than an engagement. The fleet is not what defines them. It never was. It is simply the thing that makes the conversations work. What defines them, what has always defined them, from the moment Marin Solis walked through the umbilical with a smile, and Callum Park stood at the archive entrance with hunger in his eyes, is the reaching. The constant, relentless, entirely characteristic reaching toward the next thing. More settlements, more exchange programs, more research, more connection. They are not a civilization that sits in what it has built and calls it finished. I do not think they know how to do that. I have looked in their history for examples of it and I have not found any. The document on my desk this morning is a translation. A complete translation. The precursor caution records. The full codex, not the fragments I have spent 30 years collecting and partially reconstructing, were found 14 months ago by a joint human-maketh archaeological team working in the Outer Meridian, near the debris field where Reskavith's original tablet came from. The precursor station that had been destroyed there, destroyed long ago, for reasons no one yet knows, had a vault beneath its primary structure, built into the bedrock of a small moon, sealed and protected with materials that had held against 90,000 years of time and the violence of the station's destruction above them. The vault contained 47 individual tablets. The team spent 14 months working on them. Translation, reconstruction, verification, cross-referencing against every fragment we already had. The human archaeologists and the Maketh scholars worked side by side, which I understand was occasionally contentious in the small interpersonal way that scholars are always contentious with each other, and also deeply productive in the way that happens when people who care about the same thing work together on it. Tariq brought me the completed translation this morning. All 47 tablets, rendered into current galactic common, organized by the precursor's own internal numbering system. 612 pages. I have been reading since he handed it to me. I am not finished. I will not be finished today. Some documents deserve more than one sitting, and this is the most important document in the archive's 40,000-year history. I intend to read it properly. But I have read enough to know what I need to say. Most of the codex is what I expected. Observations about species the precursors encountered. Warnings calibrated to specific behaviors and specific risks. Notes on civilizations that had already appeared and grown during the precursor's long lifespan. Some that still exist today. Some that are on my shelves. Practical guidance on contact protocols, territorial approaches, the particular dynamics of civilizations in their early expansion phases. It is extraordinary scholarship, 90,000 years old, and still largely applicable. The precursors understood this galaxy in ways that will take current scholarship generations to fully absorb, but it is the final section of the codex that I have been sitting with since I read it 2 hours ago. The section that comes after all the warnings, after all the cautions, after all the careful and thorough documentation of everything that could go wrong and how to avoid it. The final section is different in tone from everything that precedes it. The clinical language is gone. What is there instead is something that reads, unmistakably, like a letter. Not a record, not a warning. A letter. Written by people who knew they were leaving and wanted to say something true before they went. I am going to describe what it says, rather than quote it directly, because some things deserve to be described in your own words, rather than simply repeated. But I will be faithful to it. The precursors wrote that they had spent 90,000 years watching life rise in this galaxy, and that of everything they had seen, every civilization, every achievement, every terrible mistake and every remarkable recovery, there was one thing they had not expected. One thing that had surprised them, late in their long history, when they thought they had seen everything there was to see. They had expected intelligence to be common. It was not as common as they had hoped. They had expected spaceflight to spread widely. It spread, but slowly, and many species reached it and then lost it again. They had expected conflict to be the primary shape of interspecies contact. It was, for a long time, in the early periods they observed. What they had not expected, what had genuinely surprised them, this civilization of 90,000 years, was the possibility of what they called, in their language, a word that the translators have rendered as convergence, a point at which enough civilizations had survived their worst moments, learned from them, and chosen to build something together rather than against each other, that the shape of the galaxy began to change. They had not seen it happen. They were leaving before it did. But they believed it was possible. And they believed, here is the part I have read 4 times this morning, in the early light of my office, with my old hands holding 600 pages of the most important document I will ever read. They believed that the species most likely to make it possible was the one they had warned about. The small one, from the mostly water world. The one that carried its losses and converted them into fuel. The one that had never, in all the long time the precursors observed them, stopped reaching toward the next thing. The warning was real. The precursors meant every word of it. The humans were dangerous, were and are, and that was not a metaphor and not an exaggeration. But the warning was only half of what they wrote. The other half said, if you are lucky enough to be in the galaxy when they are awake and moving, do not stand against them, stand with them. Because the thing they are reaching toward is the thing that everything worth building is reaching toward. And the galaxy is better with them in it than it would be without them. The final line of the Precursor Codex, the last thing the oldest civilization in this galaxy chose to write before they left, I will render as closely as I can. It said, we have seen much. We leave you this. The brief ones remember everything, and what they build lasts longer than they do, and that is the most hopeful thing we have found in all our years among the stars. I set the translation down on my desk, and looked out my window for a long time. Velmora outside, going about its morning, the transit lines running, the market quarter opening, ships coming and going from the outer platforms in the ordinary flow of a day that had no idea it was anything other than ordinary. Then I picked up my communication terminal and sent a message to Dr. Vasquez, who was currently on Velmora for a commission session and whose contact information I had kept current for 16 years. The message said, the complete translation has arrived. I believe you will want to read it today. Come to the archive when you can. Her response came back in 4 minutes. On my way. I smiled. Not the uncomplicated delight of Marin Solis, or the hungry reverence of Callum Park. Something older than both of those, and quieter. The smile of a person who has waited a very long time for the right moment, and has just recognized it. She arrived 40 minutes later, slightly out of breath, which told me she had taken the fast transit line rather than the slow one. I led her to my office rather than the secured room, because the secured room was no longer where the most important thing lived. The most important thing was now on my desk, in a neat stack of 612 pages. I told her what it contained. I described the final section. I read her the last line. She was quiet for a long time after I read it. Then she said, we need to tell the council. Yes, I said. And the Maketh Commission, and the Aceric delegation, and our own government. She paused. Actually, the whole framework. Everyone who is part of the framework needs to know what the precursors wrote. Yes, I said again. She looked at the stack of pages. Can I read it? I was hoping you would read it here, I said, so we can discuss it properly. She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair Yev Tan had sat in, years ago, when she came to tell me the council was ready to listen. Dr. Vasquez picked up the translation and began to read. I let her read. I did not interrupt. I went and made warm broth, brought her a cup of the hot drink she preferred, and sat at my desk reading my own copy, the two of us working through the same pages in comfortable parallel silence, the way scholars work when they are doing something that matters. She read for 3 hours. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at me with an expression I recognized from the secured room, 16 years ago, when she had stood in front of the cracked tablet and said the precursors didn't fully understand us either. They were not afraid of us, she said. That's what this says. Not really. They were cautious, and the caution was genuine, and the warning was real, but underneath it, they were hopeful. Yes, I said. They went to all that trouble, all those tablets, scattered across multiple locations, sealed and protected, designed to survive as long as possible, and what they were really trying to do was hand something off. She paused. They couldn't stay to see how it went, so they left notes. The most thorough notes ever written, I said. She almost laughed. Then she said, the commission needs to know, not just the translation, the context, what it means for how the framework is understood, what it means for where we go next. She looked at me. Will you present it? You are the one who has spent 30 years building toward this. I thought about that. I thought about my first presentation to the council, 20 years ago, standing in the circular chamber and saying, let me offer you a complete picture. I thought about Yev Tan saying the council is finally ready to listen. I thought about all the reports I had filed, all the sessions I had attended on the edges of rooms, All the years of watching and recording and building toward the understanding I had been trying to give people for most of my adult life. I will present it, I said. But I would like you to present it with me. You understand the precursor scholarship as well as anyone living, and you understand what the document says about your own species in a way that I, even after 30 years, cannot fully match. I paused. Also, you are a better speaker than I am. I have always been thorough. You are actually compelling. She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled. The full, genuine, unguarded smile that I had seen on every human who mattered to me, in some form or another, across 21 years. I accept, she said. The joint commission session was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, Dr. Vasquez sent the translation to the Terran Compact government, to the Maketh Historical Commission, and to Vel Karath's office in the Aceric Governing Council. She sent it with a brief note that said, "Please read this before the session. It will change how you hear what we have to say." I spent those 2 weeks doing what I have always done when something important needs to be communicated. I prepared. I organized the material. I built the argument from the foundation up, the way you build anything that needs to hold weight. I wrote notes and then wrote better notes, and then put the notes away, and let the material settle into the shape it wanted to take. On the evening before the session, I went to the secured room one last time. The tablet was still there. It would always be there. It was the archive, and nothing left the archive. But it was no longer the most important thing in the collection. It was now the beginning of a story whose ending we had found, and that changed what it was. The way context always changes what things are. I stood in front of it for a while. I thought about Reskaveth, who had handed it to me with both hands 31 years ago, and whose life had gone on in its ordinary way, who was now retired and living near the sea on Velmora's southern coast, and who I had told about the complete codex in a personal message that he had responded to with a long pause, and then, I always knew that tablet was something. I am glad it turned out to be something good. I thought about all of them. Marin Solis, who had retired from the Defense Force 8 years ago and was now apparently writing a book. Callum Park, who ran the Cultural Liaison Office for the Compact's Velshari mission and came to the archive so regularly that my staff considered him a fixture. Admiral Reyes, who had been given a diplomatic title after her military career and used it with the same direct clarity she had used everything else. Ambassador Asante, who had finally taken a sabbatical the previous year and spent 6 months studying archive material on pre-spaceflight civilizations, which he said he had always wanted to do. Henrik Strom, who still had the photograph on his wall, and whose city still stood, brighter and larger than the original had been. Dr. Vasquez's grandmother, who had planted things until she was 92, and whose garden other people still maintained. I thought about the precursors, 90,000 years, and at the end of it they had written a letter and sealed it in a vault and trusted that whoever found it would be ready for it. I thought about 31 years of my own work and whether I had been ready. Standing in the secured room, in the quiet, I decided that ready was perhaps the wrong standard. The right standard was present. You showed up. You paid attention. You wrote things down and submitted them and showed up again even when the room was not listening. You waited, in the particular way that archivists wait, patiently, without bitterness, because you understand that things take the time they take and rushing them produces a worse record. You were present. That was enough. The session the following morning was the largest joint gathering the framework had convened. Every commission member attended in person or through live transmission. The Maketh sent their full historical delegation. Vel Karath attended personally, which was unusual for a head of government and which I noted with considerable warmth. Dr. Vasquez presented first. She spoke for 40 minutes, building the context, the history of the precursor codex, the significance of the complete translation. She was, as I had told her, genuinely compelling, the kind of speaker who makes a room lean forward without quite realizing it is doing so. Then she turned to me. I stood up slowly, the way I stand up these days. I looked at the room, at the Maketh scholars and the Sarek delegation, and the Velshari council members and the Human Commission representatives, all of them present, all of them watching, all of them part of something that had not existed 20 years ago and that was, I believed, exactly what the precursors had spent 90,000 years hoping someone would build. I read them the final section of the codex, all of it, slowly, clearly, without commentary. I let the words carry what they needed to carry. When I finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something has landed properly. Not the silence of people unsure what to say, but the silence of people taking in something that needs a moment before words can follow it. Then Vel Karath said, from his seat near the front, "They left this for us." "Yes," I said. "They did not know who would find it. They only knew that someone would." "That was the point," I said. "They built it to outlast themselves, the way everything worth building is built. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Dr. Vasquez, and then back at me, and he said, "What do we do with it?" I thought about that question. I had been thinking about it, in various forms, for 31 years. I said, "We add it to the record. We make sure it is known. We let it be part of what we build from here." I paused. The precursors handed something off. We are the people they handed it to. All of us in this room. I looked around at the assembled faces. Every species, every history, every complicated and imperfect and remarkable civilization represented there. I think what we do with it is simply continue. Keep building the thing worth building. Keep showing up. Keep being present. I sat down. Dr. Vasquez looked at me from across the table with an expression I did not immediately have a word for. Then she wrote something on the paper in front of her and slid it across the table to me. I looked at what she had written. It said, "My grandmother would have liked you." I folded the paper carefully and put it in my pocket. I still have it. That evening I updated the archive's entry for humanity for the 7th time. I sat at my desk in the quiet of the late hour, when the staff had gone home and the archive was mine alone the way it had been in the early mornings of my youth, and I wrote the final section of the most extensive entry in 40,000 years of record-keeping. I wrote about Ardennes and the garden. I wrote about the framework and the commission. I wrote about what the precursors had said and what it meant. I wrote about Vel Karath turning a fleet around after 22 minutes because someone told him the truth. I wrote about Ambassador Asante building a story as carefully as he built an agreement. I wrote about Dr. Vasquez's grandmother planting things at 92. At the very end I wrote this. The precursors warned us about this species. They were correct to do so. But the warning was not the whole of what they wrote. The whole of what they wrote was this. Here is a species that has been broken many times and has never stopped. Here is a species that carries its losses like fuel. Here is a species that builds things intended to outlast itself, and then builds more. Pay attention. Be ready. Do not stand against them. Stand with them. We are standing with them. This record will note, for whoever reads it after us, that the Velshari continuance chose, not as quickly as it should have and not without resistance, but chose, to stand with them. And the galaxy is different for it, and the record is better for it. And the thing worth building is, imperfectly and incompletely and with a great deal of argument and revision, being built. I stopped. I read what I had written. Then I added one more line, in the margin beside the entry, in my own handwriting, rather than the archive's formal text. The first time I had ever written in the margin of an official record, which a younger version of myself would have found deeply improper, and which felt exactly right. It said, "They were here, and they were glad, and so were we." I closed the record. I turned off my terminal. I sat in my office in the dark and the quiet, in the chair that had the shape of me pressed into it, in the building that had held 40,000 years of everything worth knowing, and I listened to Velmora settling into its night. Outside, the transit lines were still running. Ships were docking and departing from the outer platforms. Somewhere in orbital yards across a human system, people were working through the dark hours, building the next thing and then the thing after that, steady and unhurried and purposeful. And somewhere on Ardennes Station, in the warm artificial light of the growing cycle, a garden was growing, still growing, as it had been since the beginning, as it would be long after everyone in this story had gone quiet and become part of someone else's record, still here, still reaching, still building.